Let's talk about curating and culling a personal game library. Hey there, Brew Crew. Welcome back to Beer City Board Games. I'm Clay, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about a topic that came up on a video that I did recently where I toured my entire game collection, and I mentioned possibly doing a video about how I cull and curate my collection. So what does it mean to curate and cull a collection? Basically, I think of it as curating is choosing what games come into the collection, and culling means choosing what games go out of the collection, what games will be leaving the collection. I'm going to be approaching this from a personal standpoint. I know conventions and libraries and other organizations have ways of handling this topic as well, but the criteria for those organizations will likely be motivated by much different factors as opposed to a person's own personal collection of games. I'm also only going to be discussing games that I've purchased for myself and not about any games that I've received for review, as that's kind of a different thing. Some of those do end up in my collection and some don't, but that's not really representative of how the majority of games find their way onto my shelves. Okay, let's start off by talking about how I choose what games to add to the collection. First off, I usually try to do my research before picking up a game. There's definitely some things that I'll see that will pique my interest, usually either the theme or if it has a particularly interesting mechanism or a mechanism that I really like. I'll typically try to consider whether or not it will be a game that Jen will like as well, since she's probably my most consistent gaming partner. To add to that as well, I will usually try to find games that I think will play well at 2-player. That's definitely not a hard and fast rule because we do have a group of people that we game with regularly, but it's something that I do consider. Now, when I first got into board gaming, I was much less discerning about which games I'm going to purchase. I would just buy just about anything, usually being taken in by a fancy cover or a gimmick, although I would say that I still get taken in by gimmicks every now and then, but I tend to be much more picky now, sticking a little closer to that criteria that I discussed. Another thing that I look into a little more often now is box sizes. They're getting bigger and bigger, and my shelf space is getting smaller and smaller, and so I'm getting to the point where I'm more likely to pass on a game if the box is gigantic. Table space is becoming an issue for me too. I own a gaming table, but I've picked up a few games recently that don't even fit on this pretty standard sized gaming table. So far, it hasn't been something that's stopped me from buying a game, but I could see it becoming something that I avoid in the future. One company that I think is doing an excellent job in this regard is DeVere. They've put out several great games recently that give a big box game experience in a small box with a small footprint. All right, so those are some of the things that I consider when adding new games to the collection. Now let's talk about how I decide which games I'm going to cull from the collection. Now first, and by far the easiest way to decide, is if I've played a game and just don't like the game. But even more than that, now because shelf space is getting pretty limited, either Jen or myself really need to love the game to justify keeping it. It's not enough for the game to be okay or just good. One of us really needs to enjoy the game a lot for us to consider keeping it. Another consideration is if I feel I have another game that gives me a very similar feel. For example, I've got a couple of Troops on a Map style games that I'm currently looking to sell on to someone else because I own other games that use similar mechanisms and play styles, and I'm more likely to suggest those games. One thing that I probably should consider more often than I do is whether or not someone else in my game group already owns the game. Now, this is something that I should consider but often don't, because there tends to be a lot of overlap with our collections. Although I would argue that that overlap usually occurs with games that are among some of our favorites. And sometimes I'll decide to offload a game just because it's sat on my shelf for a long time and I still haven't played it. The way that I look at it, if I consistently pass up playing a game for something else, then I probably don't need to keep that game around, taking up shelf space. There are exceptions to that rule, of course. Some of those games I'm still excited to try and just haven't had the right opportunity yet. But if I look at it and I'm no longer excited about the idea of playing it, then it probably needs to go. So once I've decided which games to get rid of, how do I go about getting rid of them? Well, we have a local Facebook group for people looking to buy, sell, or trade board games. I'll usually post a stack of games for sale in that group a couple of times a year. Another tool that I use pretty frequently are the virtual flea markets on BoardGameGeek. They often pop up for different conventions, and basically they allow you to add games to a list where people can comment and buy, and then you can work out with them where to meet up at the convention to make the exchange. Just a heads up though, that if you do decide to sell through one of these virtual flea markets, it's good form to complete the sale through the Geek Market on BGG, which allows BoardGameGeek to take 3% of the sale to help support the website. One tip here is when it comes to selling your games, consider how important it is for you to get that game off of your shelf and set the price accordingly. You're going to have a much easier time moving games if you're willing to list them for a reasonable price and maybe even haggle a little bit as well. I have also made some trades through BGG as well, although that doesn't really free up shelf space. It just replaces one game with another, but it's still a way that you can curate the type of collection that you want. Something else to consider too is that the Facebook Marketplace and the virtual flea markets allow you to drop the game off in person, whereas making trades or sales online often require you to ship the game, which can sometimes add a pretty significant cost to the game to get the game off your shelf. I've also gifted games to friends as well, which is a way to free up shelf space and gives them a game that they enjoy that feels pretty good for you also. On super rare occasions, if I'm unable to sell the game and just really nobody is interested in it, I will throw a game away. I've only done this a couple of times. All right, everyone, that's a little insight into how I go about adding and removing games from my personal collection. Let us know in the comments if you have any tips for curating a collection that you can be proud of, or if you know a great way to pass along games that you don't want anymore. And until next time, let's get another round for the table.